I want to talk to you about another case that occurred down at Dowdy Ferry, and I haven't talked about this one in a while, and I don't talk about this case very much, but it's a great illustration of how the departments, who should all have a role in investigating animal cruelty, choose to not work together. Now, this case begins in May of 2016, specifically May 15th of 2016. But at the end, you'll hear how this case is continuing and there's an opportunity to do further investigation. But because of the way the system has been set up, there's no way to determine if anything's actually being done on this case. So I'm going to I'm going to try to, in my editing, put this little diagram that depicts the scene of what happened. So on the morning of May 15th, 2016, we found a German Shepherd mixed puppy double bagged in a black hefty trash bag along this road. It's a fairly wooded area with some residential areas at the end, but in the middle it's pretty densely wooded. We called 911, and while we were waiting, what we typically do is we start going up and down the road to check for other dumped animals. And so we found a beheaded ram, a bag of roosters that were too decomposed to report. And there were still, the rescuers were still, or people working at Dowdy Ferry, advocates, were still walking the street and looking for additional dead animals when the police department arrived. Police arrived on the scene first. So when they got there, as I was speaking to them and telling them about the dead dumped animal, and they were doing their report, one of the rescuers, Alicia, came up to me and her eyes were about this big, and she said, "You have to see this." So I left the guy there, and I left the police officer there, and I walked with her to the end of the woods where we found a house with 20 plus tan pit bulls all chained in the back. No food or water. Some had shelter and some did not. I went back to the police officer and I advised them of the situation at that address. And he wasn't really sure what to do, so he said he would call Officer Jones. And if you don't know who Officer Jones is, you can go back to the video prior to this where we talk about our rescuers dumping dogs at Dowdy Ferry. And he said he would call Officer Jones and find out what he's supposed to do. So we had a third advocate with us, and we said, so I said, okay, let's leave the scene. And let's just wait and see what happens. Let's just see what they do. So we knew we had some type of really bad situation going on at that house with all those pit bulls. And we knew that some kind of action needed to be taken. But we wanted to wait and let it all play out, let them talk to each other and figure out what needed to be done. So we went to a restaurant down the street and we waited for about 45 minutes. And we drove by a couple times. At this point, the city marshals had shown up. So we're like, oh, okay, so they're going to call the city marshals. I don't know what the city marshals would do about the house full of dogs, but okay. Nothing's happening. We drove by again, drove by a third time. I just got out and I talked to a police officer. By this time, DAS had gotten here, and they parked across the street from DPD and the city marshals. City marshals and DPD were on one side of the street, same side of the street as the German Shepherd puppy that we had found, and DAS had parked on the opposite side of the street from them. And we talked to the police officer who we talked with before and said, okay, what's the story? What are you going to do about the house with the 20 plus pit bulls? And we also asked one of the detectives, we'll call him Detective P, from the city marshal's office. He said there wasn't anything he could do. The DPD officer said that he had once actually had an arrest at that house, but it was on a different offense, and so he had no reason to go back on that property. So I advised him that, more than 10 dogs on a home with 1 acre or more is a violation in the city of Dallas, is a violation of city code. And that would give him a reason to go on the property. But he wasn't interested in hearing that, and he still hadn't heard back from Detective Jones, who he was supposed to be getting guidance from. So I asked him, well, what do we do? And he said, well, you'll have to call DAS. And I said, DAS, like the DAS officer across the street from you right now? And he said, yeah, you'll need to call DAS. So have you talked to this DAS officer about the 20 plus pit bulls at this address? this DAS officer across the street, standing across the street from you right now, that I could yell at and have her come over? And he said, no. I said, would you like to talk to the DAS officer who's across the street from you right now that you could work this out with? No. Okay. So I walked across the street and I talked to the DAS officer. And I said, we have a situation with a house with 20 plus pit bulls chained in the back of the yard. We need to have it investigated. So she was sympathetic. And she said, but I've got a couple of other high priority calls that I need to address. Let's call it in. And she stood there while I called it into 311. She told me how to call it in. We got the SR number. She watched it roll up on her system. And she said, I'm going to have to go take care of these other 2 priority calls and then I'll come back. I said, okay, no problem. So she left. The DPD officer left. The city marshal left. None of them are communicating with each other. None of them talked about what was going on, and they'd been there for, at this point, about 2.5 hours. So I called the then head of DAS. I told her what was going on. I called the then chief of police for the Southeast substation, told him what was going on, asked them to get together and figure this out. And then I called the district attorney over animal abuse and asked her to please call the city attorney and to get in touch with the head of DAS and the head of DPD Southeast Substation to help them figure out what course of action needed to be taken to address this issue. So those conversations were going on in the background. However, we had to facilitate and encourage that process because it didn't naturally or organically happen in the field. We followed up the next day. DAS did visit the property. The owner was not present, but a relative was in the home who would not allow access to the property where the dogs were located. And from the street, there was a metal fence so that from the street you could not see into the back of the property. So you had to access it from a particular vantage point that Alicia had accessed it from in order to see these animals in the state they were in. On May 17th, we assisted DAS in getting permission from the neighbor to access their yard so that they could see into the property with the dogs and confirm the condition of the dogs. And then there was a warrant being prepared for submission to the judge. On the 18th, DAS did obtain a warrant, and on the 19th, DAS seized 10 of the 20 plus dogs. By this point, they had visited the property several times, and I don't know how many dogs may have been removed at that point. We went back through our records from all of the Dowdy Ferry information we had found, and what we found, what we were told, breeders of fighting dogs will breed all the same color, so that when they're in the ring, they're distinguishable from one another as they start to fight. And so all of the dogs at this particular property at this time were tan pit bulls. When I spoke with someone at SPCA about this case, they were not invited to participate in 2016. And when we talked to them about this case and I told them the name of the property owner, they said that name was known in dogfighting circles in East Texas. So, however, they were not invited to be part of the case, and we don't know the disposition of the 10 dogs at all. But I can tell you that a couple weeks later, that at that house, that fence, that metal fence that obstructed the view from the back of the property was removed, and you could see back there, and there were no dogs. And we've been watching that property now for over a year. There were no dogs until last week, when there were probably about 12 to 14 dogs of varying breeds, not all pit bulls, some pit bulls, but not all pit bulls, in the same backyard. So number one, over 10 animals that are in violation of city code. Number two, I'm going to guess as a result of that warrant, they weren't supposed to have dogs. I don't know what the conditions were. I did do an open records request, but I was denied any information, and it was sent to the Attorney General's office because they said it was an open case. So I've just waited, and I haven't asked for anything. However, our rescuers, our advocates on the ground, found dogs at that property last week, and our rescuers, our advocates, called 911, asked to report animal cruelty, and we were denied. The 911 operator referred to 311. We said, no, this is an ongoing investigation. It's a repeat animal cruelty investigation from a case that was open the previous year. The 911 officer refused to take a report and refused to send anyone out to respond. We did call 311. And I did bring that to the attention of the supervisor at DAS, who I'm positive is taking some type of action on that. And we're keeping an eye on that property. I believe that SPCA was also brought in on this case. We're keeping an eye on the property, waiting for updates, which we'll probably never get. I also attempted to open up a case with DPD via not 911, but just regular channels. That was denied. So my issue here is, if DAS continues to maintain they don't do animal cruelty investigations, they have an investigation open from the first time we reported this, and they did something, I don't know what, and now they responded this time. We'll try to find out what that response was, and then in some way, shape, or form, not sure how SPCA got involved. The problem with SPCA being involved, which I'm sure they'll do a great job investigating, but the problem with them being involved is we don't have any access to their records. We have no idea how many times they may have already been out at this property. We have no idea what information they have about this property, the property owner, prior to these cases, and we don't have any way of getting their case notes for this particular issue. The other problem is there is a memo of understanding between SPCA and the City of Dallas that was signed in November of 2016. That document states that all records of investigations that DPD refers to SPCA need to be made a part of the DPD record system. If DPD is not taking calls for animal cruelty, those records will never become part of the DPD record database, and we will never be able to find out about these cruelty cases. Let me repeat that. If DPD is not taking animal cruelty cases called in by the public and then referring them, even if they refer them to SPCA, SPCA is obligated to take any case that's referred to them by DPD and include their records in the DPD database. But if DPD is refusing to take animal cruelty cases from the public, we will never see those records on those cases. So this is a big problem for those 12, 14 plus dogs that are at this property, which, by the way, the property owner is a licensed long haul trucker who can transport dogs, as many as he wants, for as long as he wants. And if he's known in dogfighting circles, we all know what that means. So I'm not doing the investigating on this case for them. I'm just going to give them the information that I have and wish the best for those animals. But our system is broken, and if DPD will not take animal cruelty calls, we have no way of finding out whatever happened. And if you saw the last video I sent, you'll see why it's so important that we see the investigative notes that are done on these cases, because since they are not communicating with us and getting information from us, then they have no way of knowing the details that we have that may be helping them solve their case and keep them from going down the wrong rabbit holes. But that's up to them. The bottom line is there needs to be transparency. The note I was making about dog breeders in fighting rings that use the same color is that we had found, prior to finding this location in May of 2016, we had found 7 dumped tan pit bulls all within 1 mile of this house. And if there had been an investigation on our findings, and if the city had been responsive and kept record of these dogs and had done DNA tests, we would have been able to show that those dogs were related, and we would have been able to show that they might have been able to show that they were related to the dogs that were seized from this property.